everybody. Today, we're going to talk about America getting involved in WW2. So we had talked about America's been attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, and America turns around and declares war on everybody. And then Mussolini and Hitler and Hideki Tojo, they all declare war on America too. So we are now officially in this thing. Interesting enough, the Great Depression ends on December 7th, 1941. The Great Depression is like one of the few economic crises that have a very specific beginning date and end date. October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed and the entire economy collapsed. Over a decade later, December 7th, 1941, we get attacked by Japan. Great Depression's over. Nobody had jobs. What are we going to do? Now all of a sudden, everybody's got to work overtime in order to make enough stuff to go teach the world a lesson. Because we're going to be hitting on all cylinders here. Now, what I want to do, and I put this on your notes, and I tried to put the same graph on it for the next few days because we're going to reference it quite a bit. Hold on, let me get myself out of the way. You don't need to see me. All right. So random pictures of America in World War I, concentration camps, Nazis. Obviously, that's not America, but Nazis in World War I, atomic bombs that we'll talk about. Russia. This is the D-Day invasion. That we'll get to all that here this week. All right. So this here is important to understand. It looks like a bunch of nothing, but I want to reference it so you know who these people are. All right. So, since we're going to war with everybody, we have to have a chain of command. So here's the chain of command and who's in charge of what. The top dude is in charge of everything. Why is my thing not working? Well, hold on a second. Let me go back. Oh, maybe if I click that. Boop, boop, boop. This dude right here, this is FDR. This is the President of the United States. He is the Commander-in-Chief. What he says goes in the military. That's the same way it is today with the current president. He is the top dude over the military. So nobody's going to override FDR. When FDR says to do something, that's what's going to happen. Now, FDR has to figure out who he's going to have that's going to run this entire war. All right, the guy he picks is probably a guy, even unless you're like an ROTC and you're really used to this. This is a guy that's probably the least famous, which is kind of surprising as far as popular knowledge of him. The guy that's in charge of all of World War II militarily is a guy named George Marshall. So George Marshall is the top general. The only person George Marshall answers to is FDR. All right. Now, George Marshall, the reason that he's the least famous of these guys is he never leaves America. He stays in America the entire war because he basically has to fight Japan and he has to fight Europe simultaneously. So he stays here and organizes this. There are two theaters, all right? And I'm going to circle it. So there's the European theater. This is the term used for the European theater. I don't know why it's called theater. This is where they're going to be fighting Hitler over there in the European theater. And then the second war that we're fighting is here's the Pacific theater. All right. So the Pacific theater, this is where we're going to be fighting Japan, mostly naval stuff. All right. So George Marshall is in charge of this. So he has to find somebody to put in charge in the Pacific. Now, all these guys we're talking about here are Army dudes. Army. All right. So he's got to put a guy in charge in the Pacific, and he picks one of the top generals. So this guy's like slightly below George Marshall. They're all generals. Also, they're all 5-star generals by the end of the war. In the history of the United States, America has only had 6 5-star generals. 5 of the 6 are right here on this screen that serve in World War II. George Marshall, Douglas MacArthur, Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, and Omar Bradley all end up, by the end of their careers, being 5-star generals. The only other 5-star general we've ever had in the history of the United States, George Washington. All right, so this is a pretty elite group of guys that we have here, and one of the big reasons Americans are going to eventually be successful in World War II. This is not going to be like World War I when we just showed up and roundhouse kicked everybody. This is a whole different ballgame, and it ain't going to be as smooth as, yes, we're going to win, and everybody's like, oh, we won, of course we're going to win. It didn't seem like that for quite a while, especially in the Pacific. But in the Pacific, George Marshall puts, this is Douglas MacArthur, boop, all right, puts Douglas MacArthur in charge in the Pacific. So while there's a lot of naval stuff that's going to take place in the Pacific, whenever an island has to get invaded, and we'll talk about that in detail, when an island and stuff has to be invaded, Douglas MacArthur is the guy that's going to be there to do the land invasions and stuff of the Army. There is another guy that's not on this list, and before I go through and talk about Eisenhower, Patton, and Omar Bradley, his name is, we'll do it in blue, hopefully you can see it. Yeah, it's close enough. His name is Chester Nimitz. All right, and I'm going to circle him in blue. He is over here in the Pacific Theater, all right? However, I put his name in blue and put a circle around him, all right, because that's a Navy guy. He is the head admiral in the Navy, so there's going to be some naval battles. Whenever there's a naval battle over here in the Pacific Theater, Chester Nimitz, that's the dude that's doing it. So we're going to talk about them, all right? So Douglas MacArthur, something goes on land over there in the Pacific. Chester Nimitz, if it's in the water in the Pacific, all right? So George Marshall puts those guys over there. All right, you go do your thing there. Who am I going to put in charge here in Europe? Because that's our main threat right now. All right. Hitler's just absolutely bombarding the living snot out of England. How are we going to help him out? So who we put over there is this guy named Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, you've probably heard of him. Maybe you haven't. It's fine. Dwight Eisenhower will eventually become the president. All right. These are all fantastic generals. Eisenhower becomes the most famous of all the generals, and there's a big reason why that is. So when Eisenhower gets put in Europe, they need to be one leader in charge of all the armies over there in Europe. All right, you can't have a whole bunch of different leaders doing a whole bunch of different stuff. So when Eisenhower shows up, not only is he in charge of all the American troops over there in Europe, every country on earth that's over there in Europe puts all of their troops under Eisenhower's command. He is the Allied supreme leader. So it's kind of interesting because Eisenhower's like third man down. He has to answer to George Marshall and FDR. But in Europe, every other country answers to him. So Eisenhower's big time when he gets over there because they're like, America's good at blowing stuff up. Eisenhower's going to be in charge. So Eisenhower, he goes over to Europe. His title is the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. That's a pretty sweet title. Dwight Eisenhower, however, he's never actually going to do any fighting himself. Like, he's not going out into the field and shooting. I got some pictures of him, like, rallying the troops out in the field and stuff, but, like, giving them a pep talk before battles. But he pretty much just stays back at home, inside, pushing stuff around on the map. The two dudes that he has that are going to do a whole bunch of the fighting, all right, they're tank commanders, and they're super sick nasty. There's a guy named George Patton and a guy named Omar Bradley. These guys, all right, so George Patton, I wish I had a whole class period to talk about George Patton. George Patton is crazy. I say that because George Patton would want me to say that about George Patton. So, we've talked about, if you had me for American history, we talked about crazy Sherman in the Civil War and all that crazy stuff. George Patton wants to be viewed the same way, terrified. Like, he tells everybody he is the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and all these other crazy stuff. And there's a bunch of cool stories with George Patton that are a little too in-depth for a survey course here in American history. But George Patton wanted people to think he was crazy. He's really not. He's really not. There's other crazy people like, oh, he's crazy, and they're a little loose. George Patton had a massive ego, but he was not crazy. He wanted people to be afraid of him, to think he was crazy, to think that he could do crazy stuff, and he's really not. It's kind of a show for George Patton. So George Patton, a fantastic tank general, and Omar Bradley is kind of a nerdy guy, the complete opposite of George Patton. Both of these guys are tank generals that a lot of times are supposed to be working together, but they both want to be the guy that ends up beating Hitler. So instead of working together, they just kind of leapfrog over each other at different times and are not very good teammates. But they're so super awesome that even without helping each other out, neither one of them are going to lose. All right. So that's at the top of your paper. We need to know those guys because we're going to reference them quite a bit. All right. George Marshall. So George Marshall, and here I got a picture of George Marshall here. This is this is during World War II. So if you count, he's only got 4 stars. that's you don't become a 5-star general until after all the combat was over. George Marshall comes in. So George Marshall is the guy who's going to decide who goes in which category, with Eisenhower on one side, with MacArthur on the other, which is very effective. He also realizes we have to draft a whole bunch of men. Tons of men are going over, but you have to have a whole bunch of people here in order to work in the factories. He also realizes in the military that 90% of the military is non-combat positions. We need as big of a fighting force as possible. So for the first time, he creates the women's, it's originally called the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which he lets women come into the military, but they're not paid the same. That lasts about a week, and he realizes that when women come into the military, they're being asked to do the exact same thing in these non-combat positions that men are. So after about a week, the whole term auxiliary gets dropped, and it's called the Women's Army Corps. Women can come into the military and make the exact same pay and the exact same benefits as a male soldier, because the expectations of them are exactly the same. Tons of jobs get opened up to women that had not happened before. They are still not allowed in combat positions, but being mechanics, truck drivers, painters, there's all types of stuff that for whatever reason women weren't allowed in. Tons of positions get opened up to women during World War II, and it gets filled up. That allows men that used to do those jobs to be available to go do combat. This is a picture of women in the Women's Army Corps painting an airplane wing. I have a video clip here. So just like World War I, lots of women are needed in the factories. So the video clip I have, I believe, is going to talk more about the women in the civilian factories and the things that they did in the civilian factories.
As the nation's men left for the fighting front, women joined the workforce to fill the vacant positions. Many of them took jobs in the defense industry, making Rosie the Riveter a legend of wartime production.
So if you've ever heard the term Rosie the Riveter, that is a term given to women that were working in the factories during World War II. It is a positive term. Rosie the Riveter is like women's empowerment. Women can step up, take care of the country, do the equal part as men. So Rosie the Riveter is kind of like a mascot for the women that were going into the workforce at the time, and it was a very positive term. These are some photographs I have of women working in not necessarily the military, but the defense industry, and we're going to talk about that today. So these are women that are building stuff for the military, though they're not necessarily in the military themselves. Other women, another picture of a woman working in a factory. All right, this is a cool story right here. So Phillip Randolph, and so I do this in class, but since we're not going to have a functioning test unless that has changed since I've recorded this video. I'd always say this, I'm like, hey, you're going to forget his name. And everybody's like, no, we're not. And then literally when it's time to review for this test, I say, hey, who's Phillip Randolph? And the whole class looks at me blank. Like, we clearly, now I would, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, I would have remembered his name. And I don't know why his name is so forgettable, because it's a really, really cool story. All right. So, because as soon as I tell you the story, you remember the story, but for some reason, associating Phillip Randolph with this story is hard to do. So, Phillip Randolph, where do I want to start the story at? All right. All right. So, FDR passes a whole bunch of laws because it's World War II. We're getting everything going. So, anything that comes on his desk, he's signing it. So there's a whole bunch of defense industries, and I'll give you an example. That the one that we'll talk about today is Ford. All right, so the government goes to Ford and basically takes them over during World War II. The car company Ford. The reason they do this is Ford has a very intricate assembly line, and they need Ford to build stuff for the war effort. When I say take them over, they basically go to Ford and be like, "How much money did you make last year?" And they're like, "I made $3 million last year." And then the government will be like, "I'll pay you $4 million if you do exactly what we tell you to do." And everybody's like, good with that. So, what happens is the government goes to Ford and they'll say, we need you to build stuff for the war effort. Specifically, Ford, do you know what Ford built? It is not cars. They built bombers, big old airplanes. So the reason they did this is because Ford had a very intricate assembly lines situation, which allows them to mass produce things on a massive and grand scale, which is needed to build these bombers. So if you work at Ford, all right, you're not in the military, but you're part of the defense industry. All right, so you're building stuff for the military, even though you're not technically in the military. Of all these things that FDR has just signed and somebody else has written to me, sounds good. One of the things that's in one of these laws that he signs is that any company in the defense industry, like Ford in this example, is not allowed to hire black people. You cannot hire black people to work in the defense industry during World War II. All right. Now, if you remember FDR, he's got black people in his cabinet and all this other stuff. So FDR, he's just signing stuff. But some senator somewhere had put that in there, this racist thing. So Phillip Randolph, who's a black man, he's like, that is bull. Like, I'm a citizen. Like, we should be able to work in the defense industry. It's completely a racist motivation here. Oh, let me pause this. I got to sneeze. Okay, unpaused. I'm back. Y'all don't see that. That was a pretty epic sneeze. All right. So, what was I talking about? Come on, brain. All right. So, he's upset that African Americans, Phillip Randolph is, African Americans aren't allowed in the defense industry in order to work. Well, he organizes a march of 100,000 black people in Washington, D.C. in order to protest the fact that black people aren't allowed in the defense industry. All right. So this happens all the time. There's always marches and protests in Washington, D.C. like almost every day. If you go up there now, I guarantee there's protests up there. Well, maybe not right now, but there generally are protests in Washington, D.C. over something. So Phillip Randolph pulls all the permits, does everything he's supposed to. They show up to get ready to protest this policy by the federal government. And FDR is sitting at his desk, sitting here working one day, and one of his aides comes running in the early morning before this protest, and they go, Mr. President, there's about to be a protest today. And the president's like, all right, that's cool. And goes back to working, and the guy just stands there, and he's like, but sir. And FDR's like, what? And the aide's like, but they're black. And FDR is like, dude, like, don't bring that in here. Black people have just as much right to protest in Washington, D.C. as anybody else. And then the guy's like, there's 100,000 black people going to protest today. And FDR is like, I don't know what your problem is. There is no reason that 100,000 black people can't protest in Washington. Uh-oh. And FDR realizes what the aide's saying. Now, this is 1941, 1942. Washington, D.C. is still segregated, all right? It means there's a black side of town, white side of town. There's hotels that only white people can stay in, and there's hotels that only black people can stay in. The problem here is, if this is 100,000 people, 100,000 black people, and they march all day, they're going to need a place to stay that night. There's only enough hotels in Washington, D.C. to house about 10,000 black people. You got 90,000 people that ain't going to have a place to stay that night, and it's going to be a huge issue that night, all right? Because, again, the fact that Washington, D.C. is segregated is... That's a whole nother thing. All right. The capital of the United States, land of the free, everybody's equal. Segregate your own capital. And this was 75 years ago. Anyway, so FDR is like, oh, you're right. That is a problem. Oh no. It's like, all right, well, what are they protesting? And the aide's like, I don't have any idea. And he's like, well, bring them in here. Let's see what's going on. So the aide goes and gets Phillip Randolph and brings him in. And Phillip Randolph comes in. And FDR says, okay, Mr. Randolph, what are you protesting today? And so Phillip Randolph, he was not expecting to meet the president, but he's got like big old poster. He's got his presentation ready. He's like, all right, sir, as you know, black people aren't allowed into the defense industry. If you look at my chart here, and you can see the productivity of African Americans, and FDR stops me. He's like, wait, what? Well, did you just say black people weren't allowed in the defense industry? And Phillip Randolph is like, yeah. And FDR gets mad. He's like, what moron signed that into law? And then Phillip Randolph is like, you, sir, you signed that into law. And FDR is like, oh, my bad. Tell you what, make a deal with you. If you would leave If you'll just leave and call off the entire protest today, I'm going to give you exactly what you want. Before you can make it out this door, that executive order, all right, I'm going to pass an executive order saying black people absolutely can't be discriminated in the defense industry, that there's no discrimination going to happen in the defense industry. They're going to hire the best quality people for each job. And so Phillip Randolph is like, oh, all right. So he leaves, calls off the march, got exactly what he wanted. And FDR is true to his word and passes an executive order which says you cannot discriminate against anybody based on sex or race in the defense industry. This is a picture of Phillip Randolph. This is like in the 1970s. So there's not a real good picture of him when he's younger, like when this happens, because I believe he was around 30 years old when he was the leader of it in 1940. So I have a video clip here.
African Americans migrated from the rural South to work in the industrial centers of the North and West. Many were refused jobs because of race. As a result, President Roosevelt issued an executive order barring hiring discrimination in defense industries and the government, and established the Fair Employment Practice Committee to report on unfair work practices, opening the doors of employment for more than 2 million African Americans. By the end of the war, U.S. industry and the American worker were producing more weapons and firepower than all other nations combined.
All right. So, of all the stuff that gets thrown out, that money gets spent on, there's this cool thing that gets created called the Office of Scientific Research and Development in the United States during World War II. So usually in world wars or in big wars, this is when people come out with new stuff to kill people. Right. So this is like poison mustard gas, stuff like that in World War I. So we create an entire division, find new stuff to help us win this war. All right. So there's a handful of things that come out in the Office of Scientific Research and Development. All right. Sonar gets drastically better, which is you can detect submarines from really, really far away. Radar, which detects stuff in the air, gets better because of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They also come up with a couple neat things. So once sonar gets better and you can detect these German U-boats, which are using them again in World War II, they start dropping depth charges. It's created by the Office of Scientific Research and Development. So if you know where a sub is way below your boat, you can drop these depth charges. It's like barrels that explode when they drop into the water to wipe out these submarines. Now, you may have seen these on movies or whatever. These depth charges they drop in kablooey. It's like 10 times more awesome and also, I mean, horrible than you can imagine. So what do you think the purpose of dropping a bomb and trying to blow it up next to a submarine is? Well, if you're like me, before I was taught this, I thought it was, hey, you're going to blow a hole in the side of the submarine. Water goes in and everybody drowns. That's what happens. No, it's like 10 times more brutal than that. So when you build a submarine, you know what the number one job of the submarine maker is? Make sure it doesn't leak. There's all these different layers of a submarine. It's like almost impossible to knock a hole in a submarine. Like you just basically can't do it. So if you blow up something next to it, it really just pushes the submarine over. It doesn't really like blow a hole in it. So what they do is when you drop these bombs and they detonate next to it, what it does is it disperses water. We get all sciencey here, right? So it disperses the water around the explosion, which jacks up the water pressure around the submarine. When the water pressure around a submarine skyrockets real quick, the entire submarine crunches in a little bit. Once it crunches in, all the air, because it's not designed to leak, all the air inside, the air pressure skyrockets because it's been crunched in, and everybody's head explodes inside. And then it sinks. Yeah, it's brutal, man. So these depth charges are no joke. So you can detect the submarines, you can drop depth charges. They also create a delousing powder, which prevents soldiers from getting lice. So literally in the textbook, I'm going to tell you a story about me looking like a fool. In the textbook, it says America is the first army ever to go to war lice-free. Lice gives all types of diseases and stuff and can spread it back and forth. So lice, we had a way of getting rid of lice, and we had no problem with lice in World War II. So while I was doing my student teaching out of college, I was like 22 years old, and I was teaching at North Pitt High School next to East Carolina. You basically, student teaching is like indentured servitude. You have to teach for a semester for free to make sure that, you don't hate it. So it's interesting because North Pitt is like the school is about 90% black. The first class I taught, and this was one of the first lessons I taught, was talking about lice. The entire, I was the only white person in the class, and there was not a Hispanic person in the class. I believe the entire class was African Americans. So I'm standing up there, and I dropped this factoid: America is the first army to go to war without lice, and it's going to move on. And it was an honors class. One of the kids raised his hand and says, "Mr. Wagstaff, so you're telling me no African country has ever had an army?" I'm like, okay, this kid's challenging me like the first day. I was like, of course they did. And he's like, well, then obviously. And he's just like looking at me. I'm like, obviously what? He's like, well, obviously America's not the first army to go to war without lice. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then like, Mr. Wagstaff, like another citizen, Mr. Black people don't get lice, right? And I'm like, what? That's not a thing. And they're like, no, it really is. I'm like, no, it's not. Black people get lice. They're like, no, go look it up. And so black people don't get lice. So like in my very first day of being a history teacher, I just said something horrifically wrong, kind of set the tone for the rest of the things I say in my life. Is apparently I'm wrong all the time. But I went back to the textbook. I'm like, and the textbook says America's the first army to go to war, because apparently the book is racist too, or just ignorant. I don't know if that's a racism thing other than just not knowing things. So so black people don't get lice, but now nobody else does in the military because they have a way of keeping the lice off of you. So if that was all it was, it probably wouldn't be worth it to take time to talk about the Office of Scientific Research and Development itself. However, the Office of Scientific Research and Development is what is responsible for the creation of the atomic bomb. So here's what happens. There is this genius that lives in Germany. His name is Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein is Jewish. All right. So Albert Einstein lives in Germany, and he makes good money figuring out stuff. He has come up with, in the 1920s, his idea of the theory of relativity. E equals mc squared. Long story short, he believes the smallest possible thing in the universe is an atom. Like, nothing is smaller than an atom. Can't be. So what happens if you cut an atom in half? Wouldn't half an atom be smaller than an atom? So he believes through math and junk, all right, super smart stuff, because he's like a mathematician basically. Like he doesn't actually build stuff; he just comes up with like the instruction book, kind of the sciencey aspect of it. He believes that if you cut an atom in half, it will cause a chain reaction and create a whole bunch of energy. All right, so it was like kind of super top secret. They're trying to do it. Then Hitler's going to take over. Hitler clearly is anti-Jewish. And Albert Einstein's like, man, this dude's kind of a turd. Like, I don't really like him. Well, Hitler continues to be a turd, starts being discriminatory again. This is long before the Holocaust. This is the early 1930s. Long before the Holocaust and stuff like that. And he's just kind of being a jerk. So after like Kristallnacht, I think Albert Einstein didn't even stay till Kristallnacht. Like, he knew to get out before this. So now Hitler would never have messed with Albert Einstein purely because Albert Einstein is a genius and Albert Einstein is very valuable, and Hitler isn't a moron. He knew he could use Albert Einstein but anyway. So Albert Einstein asked if he can have permission to go over to America and give a speech at a college. This is the early 1930s, before anybody has beef with each other, and Hitler and the Nazi Party give him permission to do that. So he flies over to America, gives a speech at the college over here, and then just stays. He's like, I ain't going back. So he's like an illegal immigrant in America. Fast forward years, and he's just stayed here. World War II starts. we find out one of the Nazis' top scientists, this guy named Albert Einstein, has been hiding in America. So they go and they arrest him, and they're going to send him back to Germany. This is a Jewish guy that ran from Germany going back. This ain't going to be good for me. He's like, no, don't let me go back. It'll be bad. He's like, I can give you any information that you want. So he basically says, I'm only going to talk to FDR about it. So FDR and Albert Einstein sit down, because Albert Einstein's already famous at this time. Sit down and he says, look, there's this thing called a theory of relativity in Germany, and I'm pretty confident that Hitler's going to try to use it to make a bomb. And when he says this, when he says he's going to create a bomb, FDR is like, well, can you make us a bomb? And Albert Einstein's like, nah. Like, so the theory of relativity, it's like a 35-page math problem. There's one copy of it. It's in Germany. I'm not going to be able to recreate that. And then FDR is like, well, here's your plane ticket back. And Albert Einstein's like, well, let me try. All right. So Albert Einstein, one of the greatest feats of the human brain in the history of the world, out of memory of only having seen it a few times, handwrites the entire theory of relativity that took him like a decade to work on and recreates it. We know now it's perfectly, but honestly at the time, like, is this dude just writing down random numbers so he doesn't have to go back to Germany? So he gives the theory of relativity to FDR, and he's like, so if I get a smart person, they can make a bomb out of this. And Albert Einstein's like, man, I thought y'all use it for like renewable energy or something, not like a bomb. He's like, so I can make a bomb out of it? Albert Einstein's like, you just do whatever it is that you want to do with it. So, they leave, or Albert Einstein leaves, and FDR calls in like the smartest engineer he can, this guy named J. Robert Oppenheimer. He calls in J. Robert Oppenheimer, comes in. J. Robert Oppenheimer is like 30 years old. J. Robert Oppenheimer comes in, and FDR says, hey, really smart dude gave me this math problem. Can you make a bomb out of it? And J. Robert Oppenheimer is like, what? And he opens up, flipping through. He's like, this is advanced. Like, is this for real? And FDR says, I think it is. He may have lied a little bit. He's like, well, if one number is off, none of this is going to work. He's like, well, let's try it, because I think Germany is trying to make a bomb using this math stuff. I need you to go make one. And so he's like, oh, fine. So he gets a blank check. He can spend as much money as he wants. The only thing is it has to be top secret. There's only 3 people in America that know that this is going to be attempted. J. Robert Oppenheimer, Albert Einstein, who is just like now just hanging out at his house, and FDR. Only 3 people can know about it. You have unlimited money. Yeah, this is what J. Robert Oppenheimer is told. Unlimited money. Go find a way to do this. So he goes to New York University and rents an empty gym. All right. So this project ends up being called the Manhattan Project, because this is where it's going to be like assembled at. So obviously, J. Robert Oppenheimer can't just do everything by himself all the time. So here's what's crazy. 600,000 people are going to be working on the Manhattan Project, and they have no idea what they're working on. Here's how he does that. So he makes like blueprints, right? And he needs a fancy switch, like a toggle switch, on or off, right? And he needs this somewhere on the bomb. So what he does is he contacts the best switch maker in America, some dude in Arizona maybe. Like, hey, I need you to make me a switch. And the guy's like, all right, well, I can get to you. You know, just send me the blueprints. I can make you, but it'll be a couple months before I get to it. And then J. Robert Oppenheimer's like, what if I give you $10,000? Can I have it this week? And he's like, for $10,000, you'll have it Thursday. So so that guy goes and makes a switch off the little tiny blueprints he has for that switch, and then sends it back to J. Robert Oppenheimer. This is how J. Robert Oppenheimer is going to build the atomic bombs, plural. He has people all over the country doing all types of random stuff, but they don't know what they're doing it for. They just know they're getting paid really well, and they're shipping everything to J. Robert Oppenheimer. I imagine J. Robert Oppenheimer sitting in the middle of like an empty gymnasium with all these like Amazon boxes around him, like unpacking them and like snapping stuff together. There is a very small chance this is going to work, but because we are completely convinced Germany is trying to make it, we need to have it too. Because if it doesn't work for us, it doesn't work for them either. That's our thought process. So the Manhattan Project takes place throughout the entire World War II, and everybody kind of forgets about it. J. Robert Oppenheimer's over here just, about to have an aneurysm every day over it. But there's like like pretty much it feels like a 0% chance. We probably had all types of Manhattan projects with secret stuff that just thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were going to work on things that never filled out, but this one will working out. This is it's a video, but it's not that good. This is one of Albert Einstein, who came up with the theory of relativity. All right, Office of Price Administration. One of the things that they do in World War II is they freeze prices so that you don't have inflation like you had in World War I. They're also trying to, by taxing more people, there's less money to spend, reducing demand. Income tax comes out. They swear income tax is only going to last during World War II. We still pay income tax today. Rationing. Rationing worked out really well. I got a good picture of it here. Rationing. All right, in our current situation, imagine they had done this for toilet paper. This is rationing in America has typically worked out well. Rationing, all right, with rationing, everybody gets enough to survive. Like you're not going without anything. If you don't ration things, all right, what happens is people go and hoard it all right, and then leaves other people without. Just like the whole toilet paper issue that happened with this whole coronavirus thing, is you couldn't get toilet paper because everybody's just stockpiling because apparently that's necessary for the coronavirus. So rationing happened in World War II, but not because we had a shortage or anything, but we wanted to prevent this from happening, of people hoarding stuff and everybody else having to go without. All right, the War Productions Board also decides who converts from peacetime to a wartime industry. They organize nationwide drives for tin cans, paper, etc. Let's see. Got a video on this one.
As the U.S. built its fighting forces, the president called upon the nation's manufacturing might to build the implements of war needed to fight the enemy.
We shall need everything that we have and everything that our allies have to defeat the Nazis and the fascists in the coming battles on the continent of Europe, and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
The U.S. mobilization for war stands among the monumental achievements in American history. In record time, the U.S. economy was completely transformed from producing peacetime goods to maximum war production. FDR established the War Production Board, the WPB, to direct the effort, and he set demanding goals.
In this year 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes, 45,000 tanks, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns. We shall build 8
That's a Liberty ship. We're getting ready to talk about it.
Merchant ships.
Nationwide drives were organized to collect scrap iron and tin, rags, paper, even cooking fat to be recycled into war supplies. And metals and other raw materials were diverted for use in war production. New defense plants and shipyards sprang up seemingly overnight, and existing factories were converted to military manufacturing. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser became a national hero as his shipyards built nearly 1,500 Liberty ships.
We're going to talk about those.
Henry Ford's massive assembly lines turned out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. And the nation's railroads made delivering raw materials and war supplies their top priority. After a decade-long depression, war production revitalized the U.S. economy. Suddenly, a nation with too few jobs had to work overtime to supply the Allied effort.
All right, so the main material that we needed was metal. Needed tons of metal. There was a massive shortage of it. It wasn't that we had lost any. It just takes a while to produce, and we had to make so much stuff that was made out of metal faster than we can make metal that recycling was very necessary. So tin, any type of metal was desperately needed. One of the things that we did have a shortage of was rubber, because we got a lot of our rubber from Germany, which clearly we're not going to get that now. So there were a lot of regulations on stuff to use rubber, especially like car tires. One of the ways to keep people from driving so much in World War II and therefore save their tires that were unreplaceable, that were not replaceable at the time, is they just jacked up the price of gasoline. When gasoline is really expensive, people are only going to drive when they need to. Because if you just tell people not to drive, they're going to. So we jacked up the price of gas, not because we had a shortage of gas, but we jacked up the price of gas to keep people from driving as much to save their tires. All right. So as soon as America declares war on Germany, we start getting attacked over here in America by Germany, by their U-boats. Like Wilmington got attacked here on the east coast of the United States. Most people aren't aware of that we got attacked over here initially by Germany. They're trying to keep us from going over there to help out England, all right? So we're going to defeat these U-boats over here in America the most American way possible. So I have a cat. My cat likes to bite because my cat is broken. I don't know why she does that. She's not declawed. She could scratch, but she bites. She means it out of love, but it's really annoying. So what she likes to bite me like right here on the fat part of my hand. So you know what I do? When she bites me, I'm like, oh, you want my hand? I'll just like try to put my entire hand in her mouth to, hey, learn your lesson. She doesn't. She's dumb. Anyway, so this is basically how we're going to fight Germany. Like, oh, so any ships that come off our coast, they'll hit it with a torpedo and it'll slowly sink. Usually the people don't die because they're right next to the coast and the ship slowly sinks. It doesn't blow up and everybody dies like on the movies. So we're like, oh, you like sinking our ships? Fine. So what we do is we create these things called Liberty ships. And I got a picture of a Liberty ship here in a second. Let me make sure I'm not skipping the question I need you to answer here. Cash and carry. Yeah, all right. So one of the first things we did before we talk about the Liberty ships, we use a convoy system again, where we go in packs, all right, across the ocean. Well, now the Germans start going in what they call wolf packs, groups of submarines. Their submarines have gotten a lot better. However, our sonar is so good and our ships are faster than their submarines, we can detect them before they can attack us, and we can just go around them. So the coolest way that we defeat, I do have a video here. This is a picture of Hitler saluting these submarines as they are heading across the Atlantic to America. Right? These, I believe, specifically are going to North Carolina. So these Liberty ships, see this ship right here? We could build this thing every 15 minutes. You know how we're able to do that? The only thing that's metal on it is this hull. All of this stuff here is cardboard painted. What we do is we mass produce them. We're able to mass produce them every 15 minutes because we sell them out. We give them like a gallon of gas. There's like one dude that get the captain. He sells it, putters out, and the Germans shoot it and hit it with a torpedo, and it sinks. That dude gets in a little dinghy, putters back to shore, gets on the next one that's coming off the ship, that's coming off the dock. Goes back out there, gets sank again. Comes back. All he does all day is gets blown up. Like he literally wakes up in the morning and is like, guess I'm getting blown up 50 times a day. That is like literally his job. We can literally make this thing, a Liberty ship, faster than Germany can make torpedoes. We just, oh, you want to sink things? We gave them so many things to sink, they all ran out of ammunition. And all the U-boats had to go home. As soon as that happened, America goes and we scrape all these U-boats off the bottom of the ocean that are like, a mile out there, come back, scrap the metal, and make them into real battleships. But the Liberty ship was an extremely effective way of getting Germany just to leave us alone on our East Coast, because we could make a ship faster than they could make a torpedo. And I have a video here of that, I believe.
President Roosevelt knew the first step toward victory in Europe was to secure the transatlantic supply line.
Let me move myself. I know. There we go.
Supply lines.
The Axis powers can never achieve their objective of world domination unless they first obtain control of the sea.
To counter the U-boat menace, Allied warships began escorting supply ships across the sea in convoys. Air reconnaissance, long-range torpedo bombers, and the new technology of sonar helped the Allied forces spot and destroy the German subs. A major breakthrough came when the British cracked Germany's coded communications. As a result, the Battle of the Atlantic swung in favor of the Allies, and the German U-boat threat was neutralized. It was a critical turn in the war. With shipping lanes reopened, U.S. war supplies began to flow freely to Great Britain, and preparations began for the first Allied land offensive.
Alrighty, that's as far as we're going to get today. See you guys tomorrow.